Hello again and welcome back. Next week, Italy will host the G8 group of rich nations with the economic meltdown right at the top of the agenda. But it's not just the leaders of the 8 richest nations in the world that will convene at the summit. Italy is also expected to unwittingly play host to groups of protesters calling for a new world order. Summer in London has more.
Thank you. The G8 has always had a strong pull for global protesters, and Italy has a particularly violent track record. At the G8 Genoa summit in 2001, a protester was killed. Italy's Premier Silvio Berlusconi was so anxious to avoid clashes this year that he wanted to hold the meeting on an island and helicopter in the global leaders. But he's now opted for the earthquake-ravaged town of L'Aquila. So what kind of protesters will make the journey next week? And how has a global credit crisis affected their campaigns? I'm joined by Nick Dearden, director of the Jubilee Debt Campaign. Nick, thank you so much for coming in. Now tell me, do you think because of the shock and in many ways the cruelty of this global recession, do you think that will make more people protest at this year's G8?
I think there will definitely be more. I mean, there'll be more for 2 reasons, actually. One, it's in Italy, and as you said, the protester died last time it was held in Italy, and there's a lot of anger about the police repression around the last G8 in Genoa. But secondly, absolutely for the reason that we've been seeing protests right around Europe and right around the world. It's really clear now that the type of economic rules that have been instituted by the G8 countries over the last 30 years and pushed on to the entire world have been absolutely responsible at the core of the economic crisis and the financial crisis that's now gripping the whole world. So for these leaders to go on meeting and talking about exactly the same economic solutions, environmental solutions that they've been talking about for the last 30 years is bound to cause an enormous amount of anger.
But surely, I mean, we've heard from Barack Obama, we've heard from Gordon Brown, both saying that they do want the way the world does business to reform. They want an alternative economic model. So should we be believing what they're saying?
I'm very sceptical, because I think if you look at what they actually do in practice, at what the G20 talked about when that met in London several months ago under Gordon Brown's presidency, it's very much business as usual. There are slight tweaks around the edges in terms of we've admitted that we have to take the banks into public ownership, for example, for a limited period of time. But actually, if you look at the core of what they're pushing for, it's more free trade in exactly the way that they were pushing before the crisis happened. It's a relatively liberalised financial system. It's a bigger International Monetary Fund and World Bank institutions that have been right at the centre of economic crises for years now.
Hold on. I mean, many people are saying that the IMF, in many ways, is helping more developing countries now, and that's why the G20 bolstered its funds. Would you not agree with that? I
wouldn't agree, because if you look at the way that the International Monetary Fund handled other crises, like the Southeast Asian crisis in 1997, it sent many countries that actually followed its instructions, its diktats, into tailspin. I mean, those economies just collapsed. In Indonesia, you had 10 million people unemployed within a matter of a couple of years of the Southeast Asian crisis happening. The same thing happened in Thailand. And I think exactly the same thing's going to happen again, because the IMF is still in charge of imposing all sorts of economic conditions, privatization, liberalization, lose control of your financial markets, of imposing exactly those same conditions onto developing world countries today.
Let me ask you this. What can be done about this? I mean, this is meant to be the greatest global recession since the Great Depression. And still you're saying it's business as usual. What can people do? Can the protesters do anything?
I think they can, and I think that's what we're going to see in Italy. It's what we saw in London. It's what we will continue seeing for the rest of this year and beyond. People getting together and discussing real alternatives. And if you look around the world, the exciting thing now is there are some real alternatives. In Latin America, around countries like Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela, alternative trading systems that rely on solidarity and rely on a tendency towards equality, using trade to make countries more equal with one another and people within societies more equal with one another, rather than exploitation.
Wouldn't you need a powerful country to buy into this? Wouldn't you need either America or possibly China to actually come along and say, actually, I will back this new alternative economic model?
Well, for it to operate immediately on a global scale, yes, of course you would, and I think that that's unlikely to happen. Certainly in terms of the G8 countries, I think it's very unlikely to happen. But remember the importance of having a positive example. I mean, just the fact that countries in Latin America, very much driven on by ordinary people, by social movements, are managing to do it, are managing to create alternative means of finance and trade, is going to be a beacon for world leaders and for people's movements right across the rest of the world. And if there's one thing the economic crisis does, it's allow us to start thinking about alternatives that many people have felt they haven't been able to think about for 30 years now. And so I think that all of these protests, you're finding not just protests, not just people in the streets, but counter conferences, places where people come together with people from the developing world and developed world and governments from the developing world to discuss how you can fundamentally shape things differently.
Do you think we've got the global infrastructure to be able to actually change the world's economic system?
I think we undoubtedly have. It's undoubtedly possible. The economic system that we see before us today has been more or less created over the last 30 years by people. And there's absolutely no reason that within the next 30 years we can't create something very differently in exactly the same way as the G8 did over the last 30 years. At the centre of it, I think, is a question of power and a question of democracy. The G8 leaders are constantly lecturing the rest of the world about democratic governance, when actually with only 15% of the world's population, they control the economy of the whole world. And it's about time that changed.
Nick Dearden, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, as we've just heard, many Latin American countries are following a socialist economic model, but as events earlier this week in Honduras have shown, there are some who are not too pleased with the steady shift to the left. Let's go over to the Americas, where Shihab Ratanzi has more.
Well, last week, the Honduran military ousted President Manuel Zelaya in a brazen coup during the middle of the night. He'd called a non-binding poll on whether to create a constituent assembly to look into reforming the 27-year-old constitution. His opponents seized on this to overthrow him, claiming his ultimate aim was to run for a second presidential term. Underlying the coup, though, was the unease Honduras's traditional elites felt as one of their own, a wealthy, land-owning centre-right politician, took a sharp turn to the left. They feared Honduras was headed down the same socialist path adopted by Venezuela. But where does this leftist ideology come from, and how has it taken hold across the region?
Socialist governments are nothing new to Latin America. Che Guevara, the Argentinian rebel, is credited for bringing the so-called leftist ideology to the forefront of Latin American politics. Though dreaded and dismissed in equal measure by the US, socialist thinking started taking root in the late 50s. Guevara and former Cuban President Fidel Castro were at the forefront of this wave of socialism. Today, socialism is once again becoming a force in Latin American politics, this time motivated by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Under the slogan of 21st century socialism, Chavez has sought to nationalize key industries, taking most of the country's oil into state control.
The oil of Venezuela is Venezuela. The oil belt of the Orinoco is Venezuela. Venezuela is free. Our oil is ours thanks to the Bolivian Revolution. Long live a free Venezuela.
Much to the annoyance of the US, Chavez is using his petrodollars in an attempt to evangelize these 21st century ideals. Subsidizing many of his neighboring countries and using his massive oil revenues, Chavez hopes to transform Latin America into a socialist unit. In 2004, with the help of Cuba, Venezuela created ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for Latin America, an organization aiming to promote social, political, and economic cooperation with members including Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Honduras.
Today, as we've already announced, we're going to sign an agreement to launch ALBA, the Bolivarian alternative to the Americas. This is the alternative to the preserved colonial and neo-colonial free trade agreement of the Americas that they have been trying to implement for so many years. The FTAA is dead.
Gaining strength, a summit on June 24th of this year saw the addition of Ecuador and other Latin American countries. But as well as garnering support, ALBA has its detractors. Costa Rica, Argentina, and Chile have not been swept by the socialist tide, opting to stay out of ALBA and continue with a more capitalist economic model. The recent coup in Honduras has also shown that there are internal threats facing the organization, with claims emerging that the Honduran government was becoming too left-leaning. Certainly, leftist policies have been emerging in the country. In recent months, Manuel Zelaya has started to steer his country into Chavez's orbit, accepting economic aid from him and, of course, forging ties. Its economy is expected to grow 1.5% this year, compared to Brazil, the biggest economy in Latin America, which is expected to contract by almost 1%. So far, it seems the Honduran economy is faring well. But any hopes of economic stability have been thrown into doubt by the latest political upheavals.
Let's discuss further the future of socialism in Latin America. We're joined by Kevin Casas-Zamora, a former vice president of Costa Rica and now a Latin America expert at the Washington-based think tank, the Brookings Institute. Thanks for joining us. I mean, let's face it, in Honduras, this wasn't really about the referendum. This was the last gasp of an economic elite wedded to a neoliberal structure that's kept them very wealthy, done very little for the rest of the population, and they're terrified that the Bolivarian revolution and ideals were taking hold in their country.
I'm not so sure. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. My sense is, if anything, exactly the opposite. There's very little ideological about this. There are many things at play in Honduras. I mean, at one level, this is a power struggle, a sheer power struggle. I mean, from the standpoint of someone like Micheletti, the interim president, this is a defeated presidential candidate who sees the opportunity to grab the presidency by illegal means.
Right, but I mean, just to keep on the economic policies, the economic impact of what Zelaya was up to as he moved closer to Alba and the Bolivarian policies and so on. Did you not think that was a huge factor in all this?
I don't think so. I mean, there were some signs, very limited, very mild, that he was taking social policy more seriously than has been the norm in Honduras.
Raising the minimum wage, for example.
For example, I mean, that's a good example. But the fact of the matter is that up to now, Honduras remains totally wedded to the U.S. economy.
So what about these overtures that we hear about between Zelaya and Chavez, further economic cooperation? Was that not really happening then?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, some of the promises that Chavez has made all over the world, he has failed to deliver. So it's a lot of noise and very little in the when it comes to concrete achievements. Even in the case of a country like Nicaragua that has more openly and more closely embraced the Bolivarian model, if there's such a thing, there's very little aid that has come Nicaragua's way.
Well, and yet countries keep signing up, and they do, of course, get the oil at a cheaper rate, which is pretty important.
That's important.
I mean that's, and I think Zelaya himself said, look, we weren't getting any help from the US. Whatever help we do get from the US, there are enormous neoliberal strings attached. Let's go with the ALBA economic model, which is more about social development and supporting each other, not just merely opening our doors to Western companies, the United Fruit Company sort of model, to exploit for their own good while our people suffer.
I mean, I can see the rationale behind that. I would have to see how much concrete has come Honduras' way. If anything, I have to tell you that I was very surprised when President Zelaya joined ALBA. He was a late convert to the project, and I met President Zelaya many times when I was in government, and he always struck me as a rather ideologically unsophisticated kind of leader, if you want. So that's why I'm not so sure about the ideological component of all this. However, I have to say, and this is an important difference. At one level, you have the ideological element to it, which I think is relatively marginal in this case. And at a different level, you have the presence of Chavez and the influence of Chavez, which are two separate things. My sense is that a part of the Honduran elite, and a significant part, were probably less irked by the ideological component of Zelaya's policies than by the fact that he was embracing Chavez so closely. And those are two different things. Even if Chavez were to advocate an entirely different path, I think there's a bit of a psychosis going on in Central America and in some other parts of Latin America regarding Chavez.
Kevin Casas-Zamora, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
That's it. A reminder that you can keep up to date with these and other stories on our website, aljazeera.net/English. Click on the left-hand side for the business page. That's it from me, Nick Clark, this week on Counting the Cost. Thanks for watching.